6 cars pulled into my driveway like they had directions I never gave them, and by the time the first door slammed, I already knew something was wrong. Not the normal kind of wrong. Not the kind you can fix with a conversation or a polite smile. The kind that rearranges everything you thought was yours. I was standing in my kitchen on Bainbridge Island, coffee still warm in my hand, watching through the window as people stepped out one by one. 30 of them, maybe more. I stopped counting after a while because the number didn't make it any less absurd. They were laughing. That part stuck with me. The laughter, like this was a weekend getaway, like they'd been invited. If you've ever had family walk into your life like they owned it, you already know how this feels. If you haven't, just stay with me. You're going to understand by the end of this. I set the mug down, carefully. I remember thinking how strange it was that my hands weren't shaking. I expected them to be. I expected panic, anger, something loud. Instead, everything felt quiet, like the moment before a system crashes. I build interfaces for a living. I recognize failure patterns. This one was already unfolding. The front door opened before I could get there. Dad walked in first. He didn't knock, didn't call out, just pushed the door open like he'd done it 100 times before. Behind him, people followed. A steady stream, shoes on hardwood, voices filling the space. And then he said it. This house is ours. You're just living in it. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Not as a joke, not even as a question, just a statement. Clean, confident, final. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because of how completely disconnected it was from reality. Mom stepped in right behind him, smiling at the group like she was hosting an event. She gestured toward the living room, the kitchen, the staircase. Come in, come in. Make yourselves comfortable. Make yourselves comfortable. In my house. Someone brushed past me without even looking. Another person set a cooler down near the island. I heard a voice say something about the view. Another asked where the bathrooms were. I stood there like an idiot for a second, trying to match what I was seeing with what I knew to be true. I had closed on this house 8 days earlier. 8. The paperwork alone had taken 3 months. $92,047 in closing costs. Every wire transfer documented, every signature mine. And yet here they were, acting like I was a guest. A woman I didn't recognize paused near the entryway. She glanced at me, then at Dad. Isn't this her house? Dad didn't even hesitate. That's what she thinks. There it was. The first crack in reality. Or maybe the confirmation that reality didn't matter here. Only whatever version they decided to tell. The woman nodded slowly, like that answer made sense. I felt something shift in my chest. Not a sharp pain. More like something being moved, out of place. I walked toward Dad. What is this? He didn't look at me. Not really. His attention stayed on the people behind him, pointing out the open floor plan, the windows, the deck. Family gathering, he said, like that explained anything. Family gathering. 30 people. 6 cars. Coolers. Overnight bags. One guy was already asking about parking arrangements. I looked at Mom. You didn't tell me about this. She gave me that look, the one I've known since I was a kid. Soft eyes, tight smile. Like I was being difficult. We mentioned we might come by, she said. Might come by. I searched my memory. There had been a text 2 days ago, something vague. We're thinking of visiting the island this weekend. Didn't think it was a big deal. I didn't respond right away. I had been working, a product launch, deadlines. I replied later that night, something neutral. Sure, let me know. That was it. No mention of 30 people. No mention of this. Behind me, I heard a cabinet open. I turned. A man in a navy jacket was pulling out glasses. He held one up to the light like he was inspecting it. Nice place, he said to no one in particular. Another person walked straight to the fridge, opened it, looked inside. What do you have to drink? I blinked. Water, wine, things I had bought for myself, for my own life, not for this. I stepped forward. Hey, could you not? He didn't hear me, or he chose not to. Mom moved past me, placing a hand lightly on his arm. There's sparkling in the back, she said, like she knew exactly where everything was. Of course she did. She had been here once, for an hour. The day after I got the keys, she had walked through each room slowly, touching surfaces, asking questions about cost, about neighbors, about how long I planned to stay. I thought she was impressed. Looking back, I should have seen it. The way she measured everything. I turned back to Dad. "You can't just show up like this." He finally looked at me then. Just a quick glance. Enough to register my presence, not enough to engage. "Relax," he said. "It's family, family." I've heard that word used a lot of ways. This one felt like a tool, something blunt. Something you use to force a door open. A group of women moved toward the living room talking about the furniture. One of them sat down without asking. Another picked up a framed photo from the shelf. "My photo." She turned it toward someone else. "Is that you?" I nodded automatically. She smiled. "You look younger there." I almost said something. Then I stopped. Because it didn't matter. None of it seemed to matter. The noise in the house kept building, voices layered over each other, laughter. The sound of something being dragged across the floor. I walked toward the stairs. "Where are you going?" Mom called after me. "Upstairs, to my room." I needed to see it. I needed to make sure something was still, mine. Halfway up, I heard footsteps behind me. 2 people, maybe 3, talking about which rooms had the best light. "We should check upstairs." "Yeah, I heard there's a balcony." I reached the top first. My bedroom door was open. Of course it was. Inside, someone had already set a bag on the bed. Not mine. A large rolling suitcase, navy blue, positioned like it belonged there. I stood in the doorway, trying to process the speed of it. Downstairs, Dad's voice carried up. "Make yourselves at home. Make yourselves at home." I stepped into the room. "This is my room." I said it out loud, even though no one was there to hear it. Or maybe I needed to hear it myself. From the hallway, a man leaned in. "Oh, sorry," he said, but he didn't move the suitcase, just glanced around like he was evaluating the space. "Great view," he added. I walked back out. Past him, down the hall, back toward the stairs. Every step felt heavier, not physically, something else. Like I was walking through a place that looked exactly like my house but operated on completely different rules. Back in the living room, Dad was standing near the windows talking to a couple about property values on the island. Mom was in the kitchen handing out drinks. No one was asking me anything. No one was checking with me. I was in the center of it and somehow completely irrelevant. I stopped in the middle of the room. "This isn't a visit." The thought came in quietly. Not dramatic, not loud, just clear. This isn't a visit. I watched as someone opened another cabinet. Another person asked about staying the night. Someone else mentioned bringing more supplies tomorrow. Tomorrow. I felt that shift again. Deeper this time, like a line had been crossed, not in a single step, but in a series of small, deliberate moves that I hadn't stopped. I had always been the one who adjusted. Who made space? Who said yes because it was easier than saying no? Good daughters didn't make scenes. Good daughters didn't embarrass their parents in front of guests. Good daughters understood. I looked around the room again, at the people, the bags, the way Mom moved through the kitchen like she owned it. The way Dad stood near the windows explaining my house to strangers like it was his accomplishment, and for the first time a different thought settled in. Cold, clear, precise. They weren't visiting, they were moving in. I stood there, in the middle of my own living room, and realized something that should have been obvious from the moment the first car pulled up. I was the only one in that house who still believed it belonged to me, and that belief was about to be tested. I stayed where I was for a few seconds longer, watching someone open a second bottle of wine like it had always been theirs to open. The sound of the cork coming loose was soft, almost polite, but it landed harder than it should have. I knew that sound. I had bought that bottle 3 days earlier, $74 at a small shop in Winslow, the one with the handwritten labels and the woman who always asked if I was hosting something special. I told her no. I told her it was just for me. I almost laughed again. Not because anything was funny, just because of how quickly that answer had stopped being true. A man standing near the counter lifted his glass slightly and said something to the group behind him. "You're lucky your parents built all this." Built all this. I didn't correct him. Not yet. I leaned back against the edge of the kitchen island, folding my arms in a way that probably looked calmer than I felt. My brain had shifted into a different mode, the same one I used at work when something didn't add up, when a system behaved in a way it wasn't supposed to. You don't react first. You observe. You track patterns. You figure out where the error started. Because this didn't start today. That part was already clear. This was just the most visible version of something that had been happening for years. I watched Mom move between people, handing out glasses, pointing to the back patio, explaining the layout of the house like she had memorized it. Someone asked about the view at sunset. She answered without hesitation. It's beautiful. We get the best light around 7. We. There it was again. I looked down at my hands, still steady. That surprised me. I expected shaking, anger, something physical. Instead, it felt like I was standing slightly outside myself, watching everything play out. And that's when the first memory slipped in. Not all at once, just a piece. 2017. A one-bedroom apartment in Seattle. Trevor on the phone, pacing, voice tight. I'm just short this month, he said. Just a couple hundred. A couple hundred turned into 800, then 1,200, then another month. I transferred the money without thinking too much about it. I had just started my job, decent salary, no real expenses beyond rent and groceries. He said he'd pay me back. He didn't. I didn't ask. Because that's what good daughters did. They helped. They didn't keep score. In the present, someone bumped into me lightly and mumbled a quick sorry without looking up. I stepped aside automatically. I always stepped aside. Another memory surfaced. 2019. Mom sitting across from me at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, fingers wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking. It's temporary, she said, just until we get things sorted. Things. Always vague, always urgent. The number that time was $18,000. I remember it clearly because I had just hit a milestone at work. First big bonus. I had plans for that money. A trip. Maybe a down payment someday. Instead, I wired it the next morning. 18,000, temporary turned into permanent. The situation never got sorted. We just stopped talking about it. Back in the kitchen, I heard someone say something about how generous my parents were, how they must have worked so hard to give their kids this kind of life. I felt my jaw tighten slightly. Worked so hard, I wondered briefly if I should correct them, lay out the actual numbers. The timeline. Who paid for what? But I knew how that would sound. Defensive, ungrateful, difficult. Those words had followed me for years. Not directly, not in a way anyone could point to, just implied. I shifted my weight and reached for the edge of the counter, grounding myself in something solid. Another memory. 2021. A call late at night. 11-something. I remember the clock on my phone reading 11:43. Mom again. This time, it was about tuition, not for me. For Trevor's kid. It's just this one semester, she said. We'll figure out the rest later. Later never came. I paid that too. I paid for the wedding. I paid for the divorce. I paid for things that weren't mine to pay for over and over again, each time telling myself it was different, that this was the last time, that family came first. I paid and paid and paid. In the present, the fridge door opened again. Someone reached past the containers I had prepped the night before, pulled out a bottle, and closed it with a little too much force. Do you have any more bees? He asked, holding it up. I looked at the label. Sparkling water. Imported. Something I bought because I liked the way it tasted. There might be another case in the pantry, Mom answered before I could speak. Of course she knew. Of course she did. I pushed off the counter and walked toward the hallway, needing a little space from the noise. As I passed the living room, I caught a glimpse of Trevor sitting on the couch, leaning back like he belonged there. He saw me. For a second, our eyes met. I waited for something. A nod. A look that said he understood how strange this was. He looked away first. Of course he did. Trevor had always been good at that, looking away from things that didn't benefit him. Another memory. Growing up, he got the newer things. The better opportunities. Not in an obvious way. Not enough for anyone outside the family to notice. Just enough that it added up. He needed help. He got it. No questions asked. I needed help. I figured it out. That was the pattern. He was the investment. I was the backup plan. Or maybe I was the safety net. The one they didn't worry about because I always landed on my feet. Responsible. That word again. It sounded like a compliment. It wasn't. It was a label. A role. A way to explain why I was the one who paid. I reached the hallway and leaned briefly against the wall, closing my eyes for a second. Monica's voice came back to me then. 2022, her office in Bellevue. Clean lines, neutral colors, everything organized down to the smallest detail. She had gone through my accounts with me line by line, asking questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. "And your family," she said at one point, looking up from her screen. "How often do you support them financially?" I shrugged. "It's not that much." She turned the screen toward me. The numbers were there, clear, undeniable. "It's more than you think," she said gently. "And it's not about the amount. It's about the pattern. There it was again. You're not obligated to keep doing this," she added. I remember smiling. Polite. Dismissing. "It's family," I said. She didn't argue, just nodded slowly. "That doesn't make it healthy." I left her office that day with a folder full of recommendations I didn't follow. Back in the present, the noise pulled me back. Laughter, louder now. Someone had tuned on music. The bass thumped faintly through the floor. I opened my eyes. The house felt smaller. Not physically. Structurally, it was the same. Open layout, high ceilings, windows facing the water, but the space I occupied inside it had shrunk. I walked back into the kitchen. Dad was now explaining something about property values to a couple standing near the island, talking about long-term investment, about how the island had grown over the past decade. He spoke like he owned it, not just the house, the story around it. I listened for a moment. Then he said it. "After everything we've done for her, this is the least she can do." It wasn't loud, not like the first statement, but it carried. "After everything we've done for her." I felt that shift again, sharper this time. There it was, the narrative, fully formed now, not just that they belonged here, that I owed them. Everything I had, everything I built, everything I paid for, rewritten as something given. I stood there, a few feet away, and realized something that hit harder than anything else that day. None of this felt new to them. This wasn't a sudden decision, not a misunderstanding. This was consistent with how things had always worked. They took. I gave. And somewhere along the way, giving had turned into owing. I looked around the room again, at the people, the movement, the way my life had been folded into a version of itself that didn't include me. And for the first time, I didn't feel confused. I felt clear, not calm, not yet, but clear enough to see the pattern for what it was. Help became expectation. Expectation became entitlement. Entitlement became this. I watched as Mom handed another drink to someone who thanked her like she was the host. I watched as Trevor laughed at something on his phone, completely at ease. I watched as Dad continued explaining my house to strangers like it was his achievement. And I understood something I had missed for years. This wasn't about money. It was about ownership, not just of the house, of me. And standing there in a room full of people who believed a version of my life that I hadn't agreed to, I realized that if I didn't interrupt that pattern now, it wasn't going to stop here. It was going to continue, expand, solidify, until there was nothing left of me in it at all. I didn't move right away. I stood there in the middle of the living room listening to the noise rise and fall around me, and something in me made a quiet decision. Not loud, not dramatic, just a shift. I turned and walked toward the stairs. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. That, more than anything else, told me exactly where I stood in all of this. Invisible. Until I wasn't convenient. Halfway up, I heard Dad's voice again, louder now, carrying through the house like he was giving a tour. "Upstairs has the best views. We'll sort out rooms in a second. We'll sort out rooms." I paused on the landing. There was a time when I would have gone back down, smiled, helped, played along until things settled, until everyone left and I could breathe again. But something about the way he said it, like he had already decided, like I was just another detail to manage, made me keep walking. The top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out in front of me, sunlight spilling in from the windows at the end. My bedroom door was still open. Of course it was. 2 women stood just outside it, peering in. "Oh, wow," one of them said. "This one's beautiful." The other stepped inside without hesitation. I followed them in. "That's my room," I said. My voice came out calm. That surprised me. They both turned, a little startled, like they had just realized I was part of the scene. "Oh, sorry," one of them said, but she didn't move away from the window. She just kept looking out toward the water. "The light in here is incredible." I stepped further into the room. "Yes, it is." I had chosen this room for that exact reason. The way the light hit the floor in the late afternoon, the way the water looked almost silver just before sunset, details I had noticed, decided on, paid for, and now I was standing there explaining it to someone else. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Dad. He walked in like he had been there 100 times before, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the room. "This one," he said. He didn't look at me when he said it. "This one's the best. We'll take this." "We." I stared at him. "No," I said. "That's my room." He finally looked at me then, not angry, not even surprised, just mildly annoyed, like I had interrupted something. "Vanessa, don't start, don't start." The words landed heavier than they should have. I took a step forward. "I'm not starting anything. This is my room." He exhaled, slow, controlled, the way he always did when he thought he was being patient. "We have guests," he said. "Let's not make this awkward." Awkward. I felt something tighten in my chest. Behind him, more people had gathered in the doorway, looking in, curious, watching. Mom appeared a second later, slipping past them into the room. She took one look at the scene and then at me. "Don't embarrass yourself," she said quietly. Quietly, but not quietly enough. Everyone heard it. I felt the heat rise in my face. Not from anger. Something else. Something sharper, older. Embarrass yourself. That phrase had been used on me more times than I could count, always in moments like this. When I pushed back, when I didn't go along. It wasn't about the situation. It was about control. I looked at her. "I'm not the one embarrassing anyone." She gave me that small, practiced smile, the one that didn't reach her eyes. "Sweetheart," she said, "we're just trying to make everyone comfortable. Everyone." I glanced around the room, at the women still standing by the window, at the people in the hallway leaning in, listening. They were watching me now, not as the homeowner, as the problem. Dad moved past me, setting his hand on the back of a chair like he had already claimed the space. "We'll put our things here," he said. "The others can take the rooms down the hall." He was assigning rooms. Just like that. I turned to him. "You can't do that." He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge the words. He just kept talking, gesturing toward the hallway. "There are 4 bedrooms up here. Plenty of space. Plenty of space." I almost said something about how I had planned each room, furnished them, chosen everything down to the smallest detail, but I knew how that would sound. Petty, selfish, unreasonable. Trevor stepped into the doorway then. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, taking in the scene like he was watching something mildly interesting on television. "Hey," he said, "easy, easy." I looked at him. "You think this is okay?" He shrugged slightly. "It's just for the weekend," he said, "just for the weekend." I held his gaze. "Is it?" He didn't answer right away. Then he looked past me, toward Dad. "We'll figure it out," he added, softer now. "We'll figure it out." That was his version of support, not disagreement, not confrontation, just avoidance. I felt something settle into place, another piece of the pattern. B didn't need to take sides, because the system already favored him. Dad clapped his hands once, lightly. "All right, let's keep moving," he said. "Plenty to get set up." Set up. The word echoed in my head. The woman by the window finally stepped away, giving me a quick smile as she passed. "It's really a beautiful room," she said. I nodded. Thank you, like I was being complimented on something I had, borrowed. Mom moved toward the closet, sliding the door open without asking. "We'll need space for our things," she said. I stepped forward. "No." The word came out sharper this time. She paused, hand still on the door. "Vanessa," just my name, nothing else. A warning. I stood there blocking the closet. "This is my room," I said again. "You don't get to just take it." Silence. For a second, no one moved. Then Dad spoke, his voice lower now, more controlled. "We're not taking anything," he said. "We're using it. As a family. Using it." The distinction mattered to him. It didn't change anything. I looked at him, really looked this time, at the way he stood. Relaxed, certain, completely at ease in a space that wasn't his. At the way Mom hovered just behind him, ready to smooth things over if needed. At the way Trevor stayed in the doorway, not stepping in, not stepping out. Positions. Everyone had one. And mine, apparently, was negotiable. I stepped back. Not because I agreed, because I understood something. This wasn't going to be solved in this room. Not with words, not with logic. They had already decided what this space meant, and in their version of it, I didn't have final say. Dad nodded slightly, like my silence confirmed something for him. "Good," he said. "Let's get settled." He turned away, already moving on. Mom gave my arm a light touch as she passed. "We'll talk later," she murmured. We always talked later. Later never came. The room filled again with movement, bags being brought in, voices rising and falling, the sound of drawers opening. I stood there for a moment longer, watching it happen. My bed, my closet, my space, being rearranged in real time. And I wasn't being asked. I wasn't even being argued with. I was being bypassed. I walked to the window, standing in the same spot where that woman had been earlier. The view was still the same. Water stretching out, calm and steady. Light shifting across the surface. Nothing out there had changed. Inside, everything had. Behind me, I heard Dad's voice again, already halfway down the hall, assigning another room. "This one will work. Put your things here." I turned slightly, looking back into the room. My room. And for the first time, the thought came, clear and unmistakable. I was standing in my own bedroom, and I didn't have the authority to decide who stayed in it. I stayed by the window a few seconds longer, watching my reflection in the glass instead of the water beyond it. It looked like me. Same posture, same face. But something about it felt off, like I had already been edited out of the frame and no one had told me yet. Behind me, a drawer slid open, then another. The soft thud of someone setting a bag down on my dresser. I didn't turn around. Not yet. Because I already knew what I would see. Instead, I listened. That was becoming my role. Observing. Tracking. Letting the pattern reveal itself. Voices moved through the hallway. Closer, louder, overlapping. "We could move that table out to the patio," someone said. "Yeah, and maybe add some seating out there," another voice replied. Dad's voice came in a second later, steady, confident. "We can look into that. I know a guy. Does great work on this island." I turned then. Dad was standing just outside the room, talking to a couple I didn't recognize. He had that same tone he used when discussing investments. Measured, certain, like every decision had already been made. "What kind of work?" the man asked. "Deck expansion. Maybe some structural updates," Dad said. "Nothing major, just improving what's already here. Improving." I stepped out into the hallway. "You're not renovating anything." The words came out before I could stop them. Dad glanced at me briefly, then back to the man. "We'll see what makes sense," he said, like I hadn't spoken at all. The man nodded, impressed. "Sounds like a great opportunity." Opportunity? I felt something tighten again, sharper this time. This wasn't just about rooms anymore. This was about plans, longer plans. Mom walked past me carrying a stack of folded towels, handing them off to someone further down the hall. "Make sure everyone has what they need," she said. "Everyone." She caught my eye for a second, then looked away, already moving on to the next thing. I followed her down the stairs. The living room looked different now. Not physically. The furniture was still in the same place. The light still came through the windows the same way. But the energy had shifted. Coolers were open. Bags lined the walls, shoes scattered near the door. Temporary things. Except they didn't feel temporary. A woman stood near the center of the room, holding her phone out in front of her, slowly turning in a circle. "This is insane," she said into the camera. "We're at the family estate on Bainbridge. Look at this place. Family estate." I stopped walking. The words hung in the air for a second, then dissolved into laughter from someone off to the side. No one corrected her. No one said anything. Because in their version of the story, it was true. I watched as she moved toward the windows, narrating what she saw. The view, the space, the layout. "This is where we'll be staying for a while," she added casually. "For a while." Another voice chimed in from the kitchen. "Honestly, I could stay here a few weeks." "Same," someone else said. "Maybe longer, maybe longer." The words landed differently now, not as jokes, not as passing comments, as possibilities, as expectations. I stepped further into the room. "You're not staying here for weeks," I said it clearly, not loud, just enough. A few people turned. Not all of them. Just enough to register that I had spoken. The woman with the phone lowered it slightly. "Oh, we're just visiting," she said quickly, like she was smoothing something over. Dad's voice came from behind me. We'll see how it goes. I closed my eyes for a second. We'll see how it goes. That was how it always started. Open-ended, flexible, reasonable, until it wasn't. I turned around. Dad was standing near the kitchen now, talking to another group. He had moved without me noticing. That was another thing I was starting to see. Things happened around me, not with me. I walked toward him. This isn't happening, I said. He took a sip from his glass before responding. Relax, he said. Everyone's enjoying themselves. That wasn't the point. They think this is your house. He gave a small shrug. It's family property. There it was again. Family property. The phrase had changed. Earlier it was casual, almost offhand. Now it sounded established, defined. I felt my pulse pick up slightly. No, I said. It's not. He set his glass down on the counter. You're being difficult, he said. Difficult. The label shifted quickly. From responsible to difficult. All it took was one boundary. I glanced around the room again. People were settling in. Not hovering. Not waiting. Settling. A man was plugging something into the wall near the couch. Another had moved a chair closer to the windows. Someone had opened a laptop on the dining table. Temporary behavior didn't look like this. This looked integrated. Mom stepped in beside me, her voice softer but no less firm. We're just making use of the space, she said. Making use of the space. I looked at her. It's not unused. She tilted her head slightly. You live here alone, she said. It's a lot of house. A lot of house. I almost smiled. I had worked for years to get here. Long hours, late nights, every decision calculated, every expense tracked. And now it was being reframed as excess, as something I didn't need. We can actually enjoy it, she added. We. Always we. I felt that clarity again. Stronger now. This wasn't about a visit. It wasn't even about comfort. It was about redefining ownership. Not legally, socially. If enough people believed it, if the story was told enough times, if the space was occupied long enough, then the truth would shift. Or at least, it would feel like it had. I stepped back, creating a little distance between us. From the corner of my eye, I saw Trevor again, now in the kitchen, opening a cabinet. He pulled out a bowl, looked inside, then grabbed another. You got more of these, he called out casually. I stared at him. That was my brother. In my house. Asking me where things were, like he had always done. But this time, the context was different. This time, it wasn't a favor. It was expectation. I didn't answer. Mom did. Check the lower cabinet, she said. Of course she knew. Trevor nodded, already moving. No hesitation, no awareness, just normal. I watched him for a second longer, then looked away. The system was working exactly as it always had, just on a larger scale, a louder scale, a more permanent scale. I walked toward the back doors, pushing them open, stepping out onto the patio. The air was cooler outside, quieter, the sound of the water more noticeable without the voices inside. I took a breath, then another, trying to reset. Trying to find something steady. Behind me, the door slid open again. Dad stepped out, joining me. Nice view, he said. I didn't respond. He leaned against the railing, looking out over the water. You did well, he added after a moment. I almost turned to him then. Almost. But I didn't, because I knew what would come next. And sure enough, it did. Now it's time to share it. There it was. Not a request. A conclusion. I stared out at the water. This isn't sharing, I said quietly. He didn't answer right away. Then he shrugged slightly. Depends how you look at it. I let out a slow breath. No, I said. It doesn't. He pushed off the railing. We'll talk later, he said, already turning back toward the house. Later. Always later. The door slid shut behind him. I stayed where I was, listening. Inside, the noise continued. Laughter. Music, movement, life, just not mine. I looked back through the glass, at the people, at the way they moved through the space, at the way nothing about their behavior suggested they would be leaving anytime soon. And that was when it settled fully, not as a fear, not as a question, as a fact. They weren't visiting, they were planning to stay. And unless I did something to stop it, this wasn't going to end in a few hours, or even a few days. They were building something, a version of reality where I was no longer the one in control, where this house wasn't mine, where I was just living in it. I stood there, watching it unfold from the outside, and realized something I hadn't fully allowed myself to think until that moment. They weren't leaving. I stayed outside longer than I needed to, long enough for the air to cool the back of my neck, long enough for the noise inside to start sounding distant, like it belonged to another house, another life. But it didn't. It was mine. I slid the door open and stepped back inside. The music had shifted to something louder. Someone had turned the volume up, the kind of song people play when they're settling in, not when they're about to go home. That detail stuck with me. People don't turn up music when they're leaving. They turn it up when they've decided to stay. I walked slowly through the living room, taking in the changes that had happened in the last few minutes. A blanket draped over the couch that hadn't been there before. Shoes moved from the entryway into a neat cluster like they had found a permanent spot. A phone charger plugged into the wall near the armchair. Small things. But systems are built on small things. A woman I hadn't noticed before stood near the edge of the room, watching everything with a different kind of attention. Not participating. Observing. Her eyes moved from the kitchen to the hallway, then to me. She stepped closer. "Are you okay?" Her voice was low, careful, not performative, not loud enough for anyone else to hear. I studied her for a second. Mid-40s, maybe. Composed. Not trying to fit into the chaos around her. I nodded slightly. "I'm fine." It wasn't true, but it was easier than explaining. She didn't seem convinced. She glanced toward Dad, then back at me. "They said this was their place," she said. There was a pause, a small one, just enough to shift something. "Do they actually own this?" There it was. The question, simple, direct, quiet. And for the first time since they arrived, someone had asked it out loud, not as a joke, not as a comment, as a question that needed an answer. I felt something in my chest loosen, just slightly. "No," I said. The word came out steady. "No." She held my gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod. "Okay." No judgment, no reaction, just acknowledgement. Then she stepped back, turning slightly, her attention moving outward again. That was all it took. One question, one answer. I watched as she drifted into a small group near the kitchen, leaning in just enough to speak without drawing attention. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the reaction. Subtle at first. A glance exchanged. A slight shift in posture. Someone's smile tightening just a fraction, then another whisper, another glance. The system had been running smoothly up until that point, everyone operating under the same assumption. Now that assumption had a variable, and variables change outcomes. I moved closer to the kitchen, not directly joining any group, just close enough to observe. Two men stood near the counter, their conversation quieter than before. "Wait, I thought they bought this together," one of them said under his breath. "That's not what I heard," the other replied. He glanced toward Dad, then back at the first man. "I think it's hers." The first man frowned slightly. "Then why are they saying—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Across the room, the woman who had been filming earlier had lowered her phone. She wasn't narrating anymore. She was watching, trying to reconcile something that didn't line up. The shift was small, but it was there. I felt it, like a hairline crack in something that had seemed solid just minutes ago. Dad felt it too. Of course he did. He turned slightly, scanning the room, his expression adjusting almost imperceptibly. Then his voice rose just a little louder than before. "This is family property," he said. Not shouted, not aggressive, just reinforced, like he was correcting a misunderstanding. Family property. The words carried across the room. People heard them, and more importantly, they processed them. Some nodded, some didn't. That was the difference now. Before, everyone accepted the narrative without question. Now, they were evaluating it. I leaned against the edge of the counter, arms folded, watching it play out. Mom stepped in beside Dad, her voice softer, smoother. "We've all contributed in different ways," she said. "Contributed." I looked at her then, really looked, because there was something in how she said it. Not deflection, conviction. She believed it. That was the part I hadn't fully understood until now. Mom came from a family where things weren't owned. They were shared. Where the table always had room because making room was what you did. Where a daughter's success meant the family had succeeded. Where saying mine was something close to selfish. She hadn't learned a different model. She had simply applied the only one she knew. The story wasn't evolving. It had always been hers too. She just never thought she needed to explain it. but the crack was still there. I could see it in the way people held themselves now. Not as relaxed, not as certain. A woman near the dining table glanced at me, then quickly looked away when I met her eyes. Another person set their drink down a little too carefully, like they were thinking about something else entirely. The noise in the room hadn't stopped, but it had changed. Less laughter, more awareness. I pushed off the counter and walked slowly toward the center of the room. No one stopped me. No one asked what I was doing, but I could feel the attention shift just slightly as I moved. Not everyone, just enough. I stopped a few feet from Dad. "This isn't family property," I said. The room didn't go silent, but it quieted. Enough that the words landed. Dad looked at me, not annoyed this time, focused. "Vanessa," he said, his tone measured, like he was addressing a situation that needed to be managed. "We're not doing this right now. Not doing this." As if the conversation itself was the problem. I held his gaze. "You're telling people this is yours," he exhaled slowly. "We're telling people the truth," he said. The truth. I almost asked him which version, but I didn't. Because I already knew the answer. The one that worked. The one that kept everything in place. Mom stepped forward, her hand lightly touching my arm. "Let's not make a scene," she said quietly. Scene. Another label. Another attempt to control the frame. I looked down at her hand, then back up at her. "This isn't a scene," I said. "This is me correcting something." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "There's nothing to correct." That was the moment I understood it fully. They weren't confused. They weren't mistaken. They were choosing this version. Actively. Deliberately. Across the room, I saw Lila again. She wasn't speaking now, just watching. And she wasn't the only one. A few others had that same look. Not confrontation, not support. Just recognition. Something didn't add up. And they knew it. Dad seemed to sense it too. He straightened slightly, his voice lifting again, addressing the room more than me now. "We've always taken care of each other," he said. "That's what family does. Always." The word stretched. It reached backward, pulled in history, reframed it. Every time I had helped, every dollar, every decision, folded into his version of events, I felt that clarity again. Sharp now. Precise. This wasn't just about the house. This was about rewriting everything that led to it. I looked around the room, at the faces, at the uncertainty that hadn't been there before, and for the first time since they walked in, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, not by everyone, but by enough, and that was all it took. One question, one answer, one crack. The system wasn't stable anymore. It was still standing, still functioning, but it had been disrupted, and disruptions, if handled right, don't go away. They spread. I held Dad's gaze a second longer, then stepped back, not retreating, just repositioning, because now I understood something I hadn't before. I didn't have to convince everyone. I just had to break the illusion, and that had already started. I could feel it in the room. Not a full shift, not yet, but something had loosened. People were watching now, not just participating, listening, not just talking. That was enough. I stepped forward again, into the center of the living room where everyone could see me without having to turn too far. "This is my house." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The words carried anyway. They always do when they cut against the current. For a second, nothing happened. Then the reactions came in small pieces. A soft laugh from somewhere near the couch. Not loud, not cruel, just dismissive. A man near the kitchen shifted his weight, his expression tightening slightly, like he wasn't sure where to look. Someone else took a sip of their drink, eyes moving between me and Dad, trying to read the room. It was subtle, but it was there. Doubt. Discomfort, and something else, judgment. "Wow, she's ungrateful." The voice came from behind me, not even trying to keep it quiet. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to know who said it. The words were familiar. They had followed me in different forms for years. Ungrateful. Difficult. Too much. Never enough. I stood there, letting the moment stretch just long enough for it to settle over everyone. Then Mom stepped in. She moved closer to me, her hand reaching for my arm again, her voice soft, controlled, the way it always was when she was managing a situation. "She's stressed," she said to the room, not to me. "It's been a lot lately. Stressed." There it was, a clean explanation, a simple one that made everything I said easier to dismiss. I looked at her. I'm not stressed. She gave that same small smile. Of course you are. Of course you are. It didn't matter what I said. The narrative adjusted automatically. I wasn't making a point. I was having a reaction. Dad stepped forward then, just slightly, placing himself between me and the rest of the room without making it obvious. Not now, he said. Not now. He didn't raise his voice either. He didn't need to. The authority in it was enough. The message was clear. This conversation was over, or at least it was supposed to be. I felt something in me shift again, not the same quiet clarity from before. This was sharper, colder, more focused. I looked at him. Then. He didn't answer right away. He just held my gaze, steady, controlled. Later, he said. Later, always later. I let out a slow breath. No. The word surprised even me. No. It came out flat. Final. I'm not waiting. A few people in the room shifted again. That ripple moved outward, small but noticeable. Dad's jaw tightened slightly. Vanessa, he said, his tone changing just enough to signal that he was done being patient. We are not doing this in front of everyone. Everyone. I glanced around the room. They're already part of it. That was the truth. They had been brought into it the moment they walked through the door, the moment he spoke. The moment the story was told. Mom's hand tightened slightly on my arm. Stop, she whispered. Stop. Another command. Another attempt to control the frame. I gently pulled my arm away. No, this wasn't a scene. This wasn't a breakdown. This was correction. But I could feel it now. The shift in how the room saw me. Not as the owner. Not as the person being displaced. As the disruption. The problem. A woman near the dining table shook her head slightly, her expression somewhere between sympathy and annoyance. Another man crossed his arms, watching like he was waiting for it to end so things could go back to normal. Normal. The version of normal that didn't include me having a say. Trevor stood near the kitchen, still holding that bowl he had taken earlier. He wasn't eating, he wasn't speaking, just standing there watching. I looked at him. Say something. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't need to. The expectation was there. The history, everything we had grown up with. He met my eyes for a second, and I saw it this time, not blankness, something closer to discomfort, the look of someone who knows the math doesn't add up but has decided not to check it. He was the investment. I was the backup plan. That arrangement had worked well for him for a long time. Questioning it now would mean questioning everything that came before. So he didn't. He looked away. I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt something colder than that. Clarity. I turned back to Dad. You told them this is yours. He exhaled, slower this time. We told them what matters. What matters? I let that sit for a second. Then I nodded slightly. Right. I took a step back, not retreating, repositioning, because I could see it now. The way the system was responding. Every time I pushed, they didn't argue the facts. They reframed me, stressed. Ungrateful, difficult. They didn't need to win the argument. They just needed to make me less credible. And it was working. Not completely, not with everyone, but enough. Enough to keep control. I glanced at Lila again. She was still watching, not speaking, not intervening. But her expression had changed. Less uncertainty now. More understanding. She wasn't buying it. Not fully. That mattered. Even if it was just one person. Dad stepped closer again, lowering his voice slightly like he was offering me a way out. Let it go, he said. Let it go. I almost smiled. That phrase. So simple. So effective. Let it go meant accept it. Let it go meant step back. Let it go meant disappear. I shook my head. No. He studied me for a second longer. Then he nodded once like he had reached a conclusion. Fine, he said, but his tone said something else entirely. This isn't over. I could see it in the way he turned back to the room, his posture shifting again, his voice lifting just enough to pull attention away from me. All right, he said. Who needs another drink? The tension broke. Not completely, but enough. People moved again. Conversations restarted. Music filled the gaps. The system rebalanced. Not perfectly, but functionally. I stood there for a moment longer, feeling the space close back in around me. Not physically, but socially. The roles had been reinforced. He was the host. She was the organizer. Trevor was the easygoing one. And I was the problem. I exhaled slowly, letting the air leave my lungs in a controlled stream. This was the part most people got stuck in. The moment where pushing back made things worse. Where speaking up isolated you. Where the cost of being right felt higher than the cost of staying quiet. I had been here before, different situations, same pattern. And every time, I had made the same choice. I stepped back. I smoothed things over. I told myself it wasn't worth it. And every time, the line moved a little further, until it disappeared. I looked around the room again, at the people, at the way they had already adjusted to the version of reality that excluded me, at the way my house had become something else entirely in less than an hour. And I understood something with a clarity that cut through everything else. If I didn't act now, this wouldn't stop here. This wouldn't stay at the level of discomfort, or misunderstanding, or even disrespect. It would solidify, it would become normal, permanent. I would wake up tomorrow in a house that no longer functioned as mine, not because I lost it, because I let them take it. I felt my hands curl slightly at my sides, not shaking, just ready. And for the first time since they walked in, I wasn't trying to figure out what was happening. I knew. The only question left was what I was going to do about it. I didn't answer it right away. Instead, I turned and walked back toward the stairs. No one stopped me this time either. That was becoming a pattern. I moved through the noise without really hearing it. Voices blurred together. Laughter rose and fell behind me like it belonged to a different house. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, it felt quieter, not silent, just distant. My bedroom door was still open. Of course it was. I stepped inside. The suitcase was still there, navy blue, positioned exactly where it had been earlier, like it had roots. One of my drawers was half open now. I hadn't left it that way. I walked over and closed it gently. Then I stood in the center of the room looking around. My room. The bed I had picked out after spending 3 weekends comparing options online. The dresser I had assembled myself, one piece at a time, on a Sunday afternoon that felt like progress. The framed photo on the nightstand. Me, standing on the deck the day I got the keys. Smiling in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. All of it still there. But something about it felt borrowed, like I was standing in a version of my life that someone else had already claimed. I walked to the desk in the corner. The folder was still there. I knew exactly what was inside it without opening it. The deed, printed, signed, recorded. My name, Vanessa Hale. I pulled it out anyway. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Or maybe I just felt it more. I stared at the lines, the numbers, the legal language that had taken months to finalize. This wasn't abstract. This wasn't a feeling. This was fact. I owned this house. And yet downstairs, that fact didn't seem to matter. I let out a slow breath and set the paper back down. Then I reached for my phone. It was exactly where I had left it, screen dark, silent. I picked it up, unlocked it, scrolled. Contacts. Names I hadn't thought about in a while. Monica, Dennis. Numbers that represented options. I didn't press anything, not yet. Instead, I lowered the phone slightly, letting it rest in my hand. And I listened. The sound of laughter drifted up from below. Louder now, comfortable. Like nothing had happened, like everything was exactly the way it was supposed to be. I closed my eyes. And that was when the memories came back. Not one at a time, all at once. 10 years old, standing in the kitchen, holding a report card, waiting for Dad to look at it. He glanced at it for less than a second. "That's good," he said, already turning away. Trevor got a longer look, a smile, a question, a conversation. 16, trying to explain why I wanted to take a different class, something outside what they expected. Mom shook her head. "Don't complicate things," she said. Trevor didn't have to ask. He just did what he wanted. 23. Sitting in my first apartment, looking at my bank account after sending money I couldn't really afford to send, telling myself it was temporary, that it would even out. It never did. 28. Signing a check I had no business signing, smiling while I did it. Because that's what good daughters did. They helped. They didn't question. They didn't make things harder. I opened my eyes. The room came back into focus. The suitcase, the drawer, the paper on the desk, the sound of my own life being used downstairs, and I saw it. Not as separate moments, as a pattern, A system. At every point I had made the same choice. I adjusted. I gave. I smoothed things over. I told myself it wasn't worth the conflict. And every time, the line moved. A little further, a little easier, until there was no line at all. I walked to the window again, looking out at the water. The same view. Unchanged. Stable. Everything out there moved according to its own rules. Inside, it was different. Inside, the rules shifted depending on who claimed them. I leaned my hands against the glass. Cool, solid, real, and I asked myself something I had been avoiding all day. What happens if I stop? Not stop reacting, stop protecting, because that was what I had been doing, not just today, for years, protecting the idea of family, protecting them from discomfort, from consequences, from the truth of what they were doing. I had been the buffer, the one who absorbed the impact so everything else could stay intact. I let out a slow breath. What happens if I don't do that anymore? The question settled in, heavy, uncomfortable, because I knew the answer. Everything changes, and not just for them, for me. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the desk, picked up my phone again. This time, I didn't scroll, I just held it, felt the weight of it. The choice. Downstairs, I heard Mom's voice rise slightly, followed by laughter. Then Dad's voice, steady, confident, filling the space. They were fine. They were always fine, because I made sure of it. I thought about that, about how many times I had stepped in, how many times I had made things easier, smoother, quieter, for them, and what I got in return. Not appreciation, not respect, expectation, and when I didn't meet it. Labels, difficult, ungrateful, stressed. I almost smiled, not because it was funny, because it was clear, so clear it felt almost simple. I wasn't the problem. I had just been playing the wrong role. I looked down at the phone again, at the names, at the options, and I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not panic, decision. I didn't have to protect this version of family anymore, the one that only worked when I gave and gave and gave, the one that rewrote my life into something that belonged to them. I didn't have to maintain it. I didn't have to keep it comfortable. I didn't have to make it make sense. I could let it break. The thought should have scared me. A part of me expected it to, the part that had been trained to hold everything together, to keep the peace, to avoid the fallout. But instead, what I felt was something else. Space. Like a door opening somewhere I hadn't noticed before. Like the possibility of something different. I walked back to the center of the room, looked around one more time, at the suitcase, at the small signs of intrusion, at the life I had built, still intact, just challenged. And I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to say out loud. They needed me more than I needed them, not emotionally, structurally. The system depended on me, on my compliance, on my silence, on my willingness to absorb. And if I removed that, if I stepped out of that role, the whole thing collapsed. I took a breath, slow, steady, then another. The noise downstairs continued, unaware, unchanged. For now. I looked at the phone one last time, then closed my hand around it. Tighter this time, because the question wasn't what was happening anymore. The question wasn't even what I should do. That part was done. The only thing left was doing it. I didn't rush. That was the first difference. Before, when things escalated, I moved fast. I reacted. I tried to fix things before they got worse. Smooth it out. Bring everything back to something manageable. This time, I took my time. I placed the folder back on the desk, lined it up neatly with the edge, the way I always did. Small things like that mattered to me. Order, control, clarity. Then I slid my phone into my back pocket, not because I was done with it, because I knew exactly when I would use it. I took one last look around the room. Nothing had changed, and everything had. Then I walked out. The hallway felt narrower now, or maybe I was just more aware of it. The sound of voices grew louder with each step, the music blending into it, something upbeat and completely disconnected from the reality of what was happening. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, I could already see the movement below. People crossing from one side of the room to the other, glasses in hand, bodies relaxed. Comfortable. That word kept coming back. They were comfortable. In my house. I walked down slowly, no hesitation, no rush, just steady steps. A few people glanced up as I reached the bottom. Not all of them, just enough. The kind of attention that comes when something has shifted, even if no one can quite name it yet. I stepped into the living room. The space opened around me again, but it didn't feel overwhelming anymore. It felt mapped, like I could see where everyone stood. Dad near the kitchen talking to a small group. Mom moving between people, adjusting, smoothing, maintaining. Trevor leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. Lila off to the side, watching. And the rest of them, orbiting. I moved to the center of the room. No one stopped me. No one asked. That was still the pattern. I let a second pass. Then I spoke. Perfect. Then you won't mind who I just invited over. The words landed clean, no hesitation, no emotion attached to them, just a statement. And for the first time since they arrived, the room went quiet, not completely. There was still music, still movement at the edges. But the center shifted. Attention snapped into place. Dad looked at me. Really looked this time. What do you mean, he said. His tone was different, not controlled, not casual. There was something under it now. Not quite panic, but close enough to register. I held his gaze. You said this is family property, I said, that we're all sharing it. He didn't answer. He just watched me. So I assumed you wouldn't mind, I continued. A few people exchanged glances. The ripple started again, small, but faster this time. Mom stepped in, her smile already in place. What are you talking about? She said lightly. Lightly. Always lightly. Like nothing ever weighed anything. I turned my head slightly, looking at her. You'll see. That was it. That was all I gave them. No explanation, no details, just enough. Because curiosity does the rest. It fills in gaps. It builds scenarios. It creates tension. I could see it happening in real time. A woman near the couch leaned toward the person next to her, whispering something I couldn't hear. The man by the window straightened slightly, his eyes moving between me and the front door. Trevor finally looked up from his phone. What did you do? He asked. His voice was low, not accusatory, not supportive, just cautious. I met his eyes. You'll find out. He held my gaze for a second longer. There was something there I hadn't expected, not solidarity, just the faint outline of someone who knew, who had always known, and had chosen, every time, to know quietly. Then he looked away. Dad took a step toward me. Vanessa, he said, his voice quieter now, more focused. Who did you call? There it was. The question. Direct. Finally, I almost appreciated it. I didn't answer. Not yet. Because this moment mattered. This space between the question and the answer. This was where control shifted. Not in the words. In the waiting. I tilted my head slightly. Why? I asked. You said everything here is open. Shared. Family. He didn't like that. I could see it. The way his jaw tightened, the way his posture changed. Subtle. But there. That was new. Before, he controlled the narrative. Now, he was reacting to it. A man near the dining table spoke up. Wait, are more people coming? His tone had changed. Earlier, it had been relaxed. Now, it carried something else. Concern. I looked at him. Possibly. That was enough. A woman near the kitchen set her glass down. I thought this was just us, she said. Us. The word sounded different now. Smaller, more fragile. Mom laughed softly. Of course it is, she said. Don't be ridiculous. But her voice wasn't as steady as before. Not quite. There was a slight edge to it, a quick glance toward Dad. Checking. Adjusting. Maintaining. The system was under pressure now. I could feel it. A couple near the hallway started gathering their things. Not fully, just small movements. A bag pulled closer, a jacket picked up, signals, people preparing, not to leave, but to be ready to leave. He turned slightly, addressing the room. Everyone relax, he said. There's nothing going on, nothing going on. The phrase sounded thin, like it didn't have enough weight to hold everything in place. I took a step back, giving the space room to shift. I didn't need to push anymore, not right now. The question had been introduced. The uncertainty had taken root. That was enough, for now. Lila moved slightly closer to me, her voice low. You actually called someone, didn't you? I looked at her. Yes, she nodded once. No surprise, no judgment, just confirmation. Good, she said quietly. Good. That word landed differently, not loud, not public, but it mattered. Across the room, Trevor ran a hand through his hair, glancing toward the front door, then back at Dad. "This isn't necessary," he said under his breath. "Not to me, to the situation." Dad didn't respond. He was watching me, trying to read something he wasn't used to seeing. A version of me that wasn't adjusting, wasn't backing down, wasn't smoothing things over. Mom stepped closer again. "Vanessa," she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "Let's talk about this. Talk. Always talk. Later, privately. Controlled." I shook my head. No. The word came out the same way it had before. Flat. Final. The room felt different now. The music still played. People still moved. But it wasn't a party anymore. It was something else. Something waiting. Something uncertain. The air had changed. You could feel it. The way conversation stalled mid-sentence. The way people glanced toward the door without realizing they were doing it. The way no one reached for another drink. The system had shifted from comfort to awareness, from assumption to doubt. And standing there in the center of it, I realized something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. I didn't need to fight them directly. I just needed to change the conditions. And once the conditions changed, everything else followed. Dad took another step toward me, his voice lower now. "You need to fix this. Fix this." I almost smiled. I didn't respond, because this wasn't mine to fix anymore. That was the point. That was the shift. I had stopped protecting them. And now, for the first time, they had to deal with the consequences of their own version of reality. I glanced toward the front door. Not because I expected anything in that exact second, because I knew it was coming. And when it did, everything that had been said, implied, assumed, would be tested. The room held its breath, not literally, but close enough. And just like that, it wasn't a gathering anymore. It was a situation. And then the knock came. Not loud, not aggressive, just firm, measured. The kind of knock that doesn't ask permission. It announces presence. Every head in the room turned toward the front door at the same time. Even the music seemed to fade, like the house itself was adjusting. No one moved at first. That hesitation mattered, because it told me everything I needed to know. They felt it too. That shift. That line being crossed. Dad was the first to move. Of course he was. He walked toward the door, not rushed, not hesitant, just controlled, like he was still deciding how this would play out. Mom followed a few steps behind, her expression already adjusting, smoothing, preparing. Trevor stayed where he was, watching. For once, I thought, actually watching. I didn't move. I stayed exactly where I was, because this part didn't require me to step forward. This part required me to let the truth step in. Dad opened the door. 2 uniformed officers stood outside. Behind them, a man in a dark jacket holding a folder. Dennis. He looked exactly the same as the last time I saw him. Calm, precise, unmoved by whatever was happening around him. "Good evening," one of the officers said. Dad gave a polite nod. "Can I help you?" The officer glanced past him, taking in the room, the people, the movement. "We received a call regarding a property dispute." Property dispute. The words landed clearly. No confusion, no ambiguity, just definition. Dad smiled slightly. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said. There it was. The first attempt. Reframe, minimize, redirect. Dennis stepped forward slightly. "There's no misunderstanding," he said. His voice was even, controlled. He looked past Dad, directly at me. "Vanessa," I nodded. He turned back to Dad. "Do you have any legal claim to this property? Straight to the point. No build-up. No room for interpretation." Dad held his gaze. "This is family," he said. "Family." The word again, used like a shield. Dennis didn't react. "That's not what I asked." Silence. A real one this time. Not just tension. Absence. Dad shifted slightly. "We've always used this place together," he said. Together. Another attempt. Another version. Dennis opened the folder in his hand. "The deed is in Vanessa's name," he said. "Clear. Documented. Final." The officer beside him stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, addressing me now, "did you invite these individuals into your home?" The question was simple, but it mattered. Consent. That was the line. I shook my head. No. My voice was steady, not raised. Just clear. The officer nodded. "Have you asked them to leave?" I looked around the room, at the people, at the ones who had already started to shift, to doubt, to question. Yes, I said, more than once. He turned back to Dad. Sir, at this point, you and your guest are trespassing. The word landed harder than anything else that had been said all night. Trespassing. Not family, not misunderstanding, not shared. Trespassing. A few people in the room reacted immediately. A woman near the couch picked up her bag. Another man muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. The system didn't just crack this time, it broke. Dad's expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. This is unnecessary, he said. His tone was tighter now, less controlled. We're family. The officer didn't respond to that. He didn't need to. He just held his position. Ma'am has asked you to leave, he said. If you remain, you may be subject to removal. Simple, direct, no room left. Mom stepped forward then. This is being blown out of proportion, she said, her voice softer but faster now, trying to regain control. We're just visiting. Dennis looked at her. She has not given consent, he said. That's the only part that matters. That was it. Everything else they had built, every explanation, every justification, collapsed into one point. Consent. And they didn't have it. I watched it happen, not as a participant, as an observer, the same way I had watched everything else. Only this time the system wasn't adapting. It was failing. People started moving, not all at once, but enough. A couple near the door slipped past the officers, murmuring quick apologies. Another group gathered their things from the living room, their movements faster now, less casual. The woman who had been filming earlier kept her phone down. She didn't look at anyone as she walked out. Lila stood where she was. She looked at me. Not questioning, not unsure, certain. She gave a small nod. That was all. I nodded back. Across the room, Trevor set the bowl down on the counter. He didn't say anything, didn't step forward, didn't step back, just stood there, like he always had. Dad turned toward me. This is what you wanted. His voice was low, controlled. But there was something under it now, something closer to anger. I held his gaze. No, that was the truth. This wasn't what I wanted. This was what was necessary. I took a step forward. You erased me. The words came out before I could filter them. Not loud, not dramatic, just true. He didn't respond. Not right away. He just held my gaze. And for a second, something shifted in his expression. Not remorse. Not exactly. More like recognition. The kind that comes when someone finally understands they've been caught, not just cornered. So I continued. You walked into my house. You told people it was yours. You decided what I get to do in my own space. I felt my chest rise slightly, still steady, still controlled. And you expected me to go along with it. Because I always did. He exhaled slowly through his nose. It's not like that, he said. His voice was quieter now, less declarative. It's not like that, Vanessa. I waited. Because the words weren't a denial. They were the first thing he'd said all day that sounded like he was talking to me instead of around me. I'm not doing this to hurt you, he added. The room had gone very still, not empty yet, but waiting. I looked at him for a long moment. I know, I said. That's what makes it worse. Something crossed his face. I couldn't name it exactly. Not guilt, not anger, something older than both of those. The officer stepped forward. Sir, we need you to gather your belongings and leave. Dad turned toward him, then back to me. His jaw tightened. You're making a mistake, he said, but the certainty was gone from it. It sounded like a conclusion he was still trying to reach. Maybe, I said. I didn't argue. I didn't explain, because that part didn't matter anymore. Mom looked around the room like she was trying to find something to hold on to, but there was nothing left. No audience, no agreement, no version of the story that still worked. She turned back to me. We'll talk about this later, she said. Later. I almost smiled. No, I said, not this time. She didn't respond. She just turned away, moving toward the stairs, her movements quicker now, less controlled. Dad stayed where he was for a second longer, looking at me. Then he nodded once. Not sharp this time, just small, like something being set down. Then he turned and followed the others. Trevor was the last one to move. He stood there a beat longer than the others. His eyes moved from Dad's back to the officer, to me. And for the first time all day, he looked like he was actually thinking about something, not about what to do, about what he hadn't done. He opened his mouth slightly, closed it. Then he set the bowl down on the counter, gently, carefully, like he was trying not to make a sound, and walked out. The door closed behind him, and that, somehow, was the quietest thing that had happened all day. The door opened, opened again, closed again. Each time, the room emptied a little more, until there was almost nothing left, just the officers, Dennis, and me. I stood there in the center of the living room, the same place I had been when this started. Only now, everything felt different. Not louder, not bigger, quieter, clearer. Dennis stepped closer. "You handled that well," he said. I nodded slightly. It didn't feel like handling. It felt like ending something. The officer gave me a brief nod. "If you need anything further, let us know." I nodded again. They left a moment later. The door closed behind them. And just like that, the house was still again. No music, no voices, no movement. Just silence. Real silence. The kind that fills a space completely. I stood there for a second longer, letting it settle. Letting the shift complete, because there was no question anymore, no doubt, no competing narrative. The house was mine, and for the first time that day, it felt like it again. Not immediately. That part took time, because silence, real silence, doesn't just settle in, it echoes first. The door closed one last time behind them, and I stood there listening to the absence of everything that had filled the space just minutes earlier. No music, no overlapping voices. No footsteps moving where they shouldn't be. Just the faint hum of the air conditioning and the sound of my own breathing. I didn't move right away. I let it sit, because I wanted to feel it fully. The difference. 15 minutes earlier, I had been standing in this same spot, surrounded by people who acted like I didn't belong. Now I was alone, and somehow it felt less empty. I exhaled slowly. Then I started moving. Not with urgency, not with frustration, just intention. There was a glass on the coffee table, half full, lipstick on the rim that wasn't mine. I picked it up, carried it to the kitchen, rinsed it out. The motion felt grounding, simple, real. One action, one correction. I came back into the living room, a blanket still draped over the couch. I folded it, placed it neatly where it belonged, shoes by the door, not mine. I picked them up, set them outside. Small things. But they mattered, because each one restored something, not just the space, the order. The clarity. I moved through the house slowly, room by room. Upstairs, my bedroom. The suitcase was gone. Of course it was. But the imprint it left behind was still there. Not physical, just noticeable. I smoothed the bedspread, closed the closet door, adjusted the frame on the nightstand. The photo caught my eye again. Me, standing on the deck, smiling. I studied it for a second. I looked certain. Not about everything, but about that moment, about what it meant. I picked up the frame, held it in my hands, then set it back down, exactly where it had been. Downstairs, my phone buzzed. Once, then again. I didn't need to check it to know who it was, but I did anyway. Missed calls, texts, all from the same group. Mom, Dad, Trevor. The messages stacked up fast. "We need to talk. You didn't have to do that. Call me. You went too far." I scrolled through them without opening any, just reading the previews. The pattern was still there, even now. Framing. Reframing. Trying to pull me back into it. I turned the phone over. Screen down. Not because I didn't care, because I understood. This part was predictable. The fallout. The attempt to restore the old balance. But the balance had already shifted, and I wasn't stepping back into it. I walked back to the living room and stood by the windows. The light had changed. Later now. Softer. The water outside moved the same way it always had, uninterrupted, unaffected. I stepped out onto the balcony. The air hit my face, cool, steady. I leaned against the railing, letting the breeze settle over me. For a second I just stood there, no thoughts, no analysis, just presence. Then the weight of it all came back, not heavy, just real. What I had done, what it meant, what it would change. Because it would change things. Not just today, not just this house. Everything. I wouldn't get the same version of them back. The one that called me when they needed something. The one that assumed I would say yes. The one that fit neatly into the role they had built for me. That version was gone. And in its place, I didn't know yet. Maybe distance, maybe silence, maybe something else entirely. I should have felt loss. A part of me expected to. But what I felt instead was something quieter, relief. Not loud, not overwhelming, just steady. Like a pressure that had been there for years had finally lifted. I let out a slow breath, better alone than erased. The thought came back, clear, uncomplicated. True, I heard the faint sound of a car engine in the distance. Probably them, driving away, carrying their version of the story with them, telling it differently, shaping it in a way that made sense to them. I couldn't control that. I didn't need to, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to manage their narrative. I was living in mine. I went back inside. The house felt different now. Not just quieter, lighter, like it had reset. I walked through the kitchen again, wiping down the counter, aligning things back into place. The rhythm of it helped. Action, completion, clarity, no interruptions, no adjustments. Just me, my choices, my space. The phone buzzed again on the counter. I glanced at it. More messages. I didn't pick it up. Not yet. Maybe later, or maybe not. That decision didn't feel urgent anymore. That was new. I moved back into the living room and sat down on the couch, the same spot where someone else had been sitting earlier, the same spot that had felt occupied. Now it was just a couch, just a place to sit. I leaned back, letting my body relax into it. The quiet stretched out around me, comfortable, uninterrupted, and I realized something I hadn't fully understood until now. This house was never the point. Not really. It was what it represented, what I had built, what I had earned, what I had claimed for myself. And today, for a moment, that had been taken. Not legally, not physically, but socially, emotionally, and I had taken it back. Not by arguing, not by convincing, by drawing a line and holding it. I closed my eyes for a second, then opened them again. The room looked the same, but I didn't. That was the difference. I stood up, walked back to the balcony one last time. The sun was lower now, the sky shifting into deeper shades, the water catching it all. I rested my hands on the railing, looked out, and let the moment settle. Not as an ending, as a reset. Because this wasn't about winning. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about choosing. And for the first time in a long time, I had chosen myself. I'd rather be alone than erased. If you've ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you're listening from. And if you've ever had to choose between family and yourself, I want to know, what would you choose?